I stared at my phone, reading Mom's text for the third time. "This year, just your sister's family for Thanksgiving. Hope you understand." The message hit like a slap across my face. 3 years of hosting smaller gatherings, always accommodating Madison's schedule, always being the understanding one. This time, I didn't cry or argue. Instead, I typed back, "Enjoy." What Mom doesn't know is that I own a $5 million estate in Vermont that I bought with my tech company profits. Time to show them what they're missing. The phone slipped from my fingers onto my Boston apartment's kitchen counter as the reality sank in. 29 years of playing second fiddle to my older sister Madison, and now this. Complete exclusion from our family's most important tradition. I walked to my window overlooking the Charles River, watching November's gray clouds gather above the water. Madison had won again. Dr. Madison Thompson, pediatric surgeon extraordinaire, married to Dr. Bradley Thompson, living in their pristine suburban Connecticut mansion with their 2 picture-perfect children. Every family gathering revolved around her schedule, her achievements, her family's needs. But as I stood there, memories started flooding back with painful clarity. Last Christmas, when Madison pulled Mom aside after dinner, I'd overheard fragments through the kitchen door. "She seems lonely, don't you think? All those stories about her business success. I worry she's compensating for something." Madison's voice had carried that particular tone she used when planting seeds of doubt, sweet concern, masking calculated manipulation. The pattern became clearer the more I thought about it. 2 Thanksgivings ago, when I'd mentioned selling a major design project, Madison had laughed gently. Charla always was imaginative. Remember when she used to make up stories as a kid? The comment seemed harmless, even affectionate, but it planted the suggestion that my adult accomplishments were childhood fantasies. 3 years ago, I'd tried to explain my transition from freelance graphic design to building my own user interface design company. Madison had nodded sympathetically. "It's brave how you're pursuing your dreams, even if they don't always work out the way we hope." Again, that tone suggesting delusion rather than achievement. I'd been documenting these moments unconsciously, storing them as painful memories. Now I realized they formed a deliberate pattern. Madison had been systematically undermining my credibility with our parents for years, creating a narrative where I was the unstable, unsuccessful sister living in denial about my failures. The truth was more complex and more successful than any of them knew. 4 years ago, my small design company had developed a revolutionary interface for accessibility software. When tech giant Meridian Systems acquired my company, I'd walked away with $12 million after taxes. $12 million that my family knew nothing about. I'd kept quiet about the sale, telling them only that I was doing well with freelance work. Part of me wanted to avoid the attention and questions. But looking back, I realized I'd also been protecting myself from Madison's inevitable attempts to diminish the achievement. Since the sale, I'd been busy. I'd invested in 17 startups, with 8 of them showing remarkable returns. I'd purchased properties in Vermont, Colorado, and Maine. I'd established a private foundation focused on educational technology that had already donated over $2 million to nonprofits across New England. But to my family, I remained Charla the dreamer, Charla the struggling artist, Charla who made up stories to compete with her successful sister. Mom and Dad had bought Madison's version completely. They treated my attempts to share genuine achievements as sad bragging from their underachieving daughter. When I mentioned buying property, they exchanged glances that said, "There she goes again." When I talked about my investments, they nodded politely, while clearly not believing a word. Madison had masterfully positioned herself as the concerned older sister, worried about my mental health and grip on reality. She'd convinced our parents that entertaining my fantasies was harmful, that they should gently redirect conversations away from my delusions of success. The Thanksgiving exclusion wasn't random. It was Madison's final power move, convincing Mom and Dad that including me would create drama or discomfort. Better to have a peaceful holiday with just the real achievers, the stable family members, the ones living in actual reality. I picked up my phone and scrolled through Madison's recent social media posts. Picture after picture of her perfect life. Family skiing trips to Aspen, charity galas in Manhattan, Bradley's medical conference presentations, every image carefully curated to showcase success, stability, and social status. But I noticed something else in those posts. Madison never mentioned me. In family photos from events I'd attended, I was cropped out or positioned at the edges. In captions about family gatherings, she'd write "so grateful for family time" without acknowledging my presence. She'd been erasing me from the family narrative on social media just as effectively as she'd been undermining me in private conversations. The manipulation was breathtaking in its subtlety and persistence. Madison had isolated me so gradually that even I hadn't fully recognized it until this moment. She'd turned my own parents against me by positioning herself as the rational, successful daughter concerned about her troubled sister's increasingly detached relationship with reality. Standing in my modest Boston apartment, surrounded by the simple furnishings I'd chosen to maintain my cover story, I felt something shift inside me. For years, I'd been playing along with Madison's game, accepting her rules, trying to prove myself within the framework she'd created. But I didn't have to do that anymore. I had resources Madison couldn't imagine. I had connections she didn't know existed. I had achievements that would reshape how everyone saw me, if I chose to reveal them. This Thanksgiving, I wasn't going to be the excluded sister sitting alone with takeout Chinese food. I was going to show them exactly what they'd lost when they chose Madison's version of reality over mine. I grabbed my keys and headed for my car, my mind already racing with possibilities. The 2-hour drive to Vermont would give me time to think, but first, I needed to see my real home. My Tesla Model S purred quietly as I navigated Boston traffic toward Interstate 89. Most of my family assumed I drove something more modest because I'd never corrected their assumptions. Let them think what they wanted. Today, that was going to change. The Vermont estate had been my secret refuge for 2 years. Officially, it belonged to Northwood Properties LLC, a company registered in Delaware that traced back through several holding companies to me. I'd wanted privacy when I purchased it, and that privacy had served me well. No one in my family had any idea that the mysterious new owner of the historic Woodstock mansion was their supposedly struggling relative. As I drove through New Hampshire's White Mountains, autumn colors blazing even in late November's subdued light, I thought about the day I'd first seen the property. The realtor had called it a gentleman's estate, which was code for ridiculously expensive but worth every penny. 300 acres of pristine Vermont landscape, anchored by a meticulously restored 1840s colonial mansion that had been expanded thoughtfully over the decades. The main house contained 12 bedrooms, 8 full bathrooms, a library that could house 20,000 books, and a kitchen large enough to serve as a restaurant. The property included a guest cottage, a renovated barn that now served as my private office and event space, stables, a private lake, and gardens that had been featured in Better Homes and Gardens under the previous owner's tenure. I'd paid $4.8 million in cash, then spent another $1.2 million on renovations and improvements. The wine cellar now held bottles worth more than Madison's annual salary. The home theater contained technology that most commercial cinemas would envy. The master suite occupied the entire 3rd floor, with panoramic views of the Green Mountains that took my breath away every morning. But the house was just the beginning of my hidden empire. Since selling my company, I'd been building something much larger. My investment portfolio now included stakes in 32 startups across biotech, clean energy, and artificial intelligence. 3 of those companies had gone public in the last 18 months, multiplying my initial investments by factors that still amazed me. I served on the boards of 6 nonprofit organizations, advised 2 university business programs, and had been invited to speak at conferences from Austin to Amsterdam. The Charla Foundation, my private nonprofit, had quietly become one of New England's most effective educational technology funders, providing grants to schools and libraries throughout rural Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. My angel investing network included some of the most successful entrepreneurs on the East Coast. I'd helped fund companies that were revolutionizing medical devices, sustainable agriculture, and educational software. 4 of those companies now employed over 100 people each, creating jobs and innovation that rippled through local economies. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered that I was good at this. Not just the investing, but the mentoring, the strategic thinking, the ability to see potential in ideas and people that others missed. I'd found my calling in ways that designing websites, no matter how successfully, had never provided. As I turned off the interstate and began winding through Vermont's smaller roads, past farms and forests that wore winter's first touch, I felt the familiar peace that came with approaching my real home. The estate's gates were wrought iron masterpieces, flanked by stone pillars that had stood since the property's original construction. My security system recognized my car and opened them silently. The quarter-mile driveway curved through mature maples and oaks that created a natural canopy, leading to a circular drive centered around a fountain that had been carved by Italian craftsmen in 1908. The mansion rose before me like something from a period film, its red brick facade and white columns catching the afternoon light. Smoke curled from 2 of the chimneys, thanks to Thomas, my groundskeeper, who maintained the property year-round and lived in the renovated cottage with his wife, Elena. I parked and walked through the front entrance, my footsteps echoing in the 2-story foyer with its hand-painted ceiling medallions and crystal chandelier. This was my real life. The life my family couldn't imagine because Madison had convinced them I was incapable of achieving it. My office occupied what had originally been the mansion's formal parlor, but I'd converted it into a technology center that would make most Fortune 500 CEOs jealous. 3 large monitors displayed my investment portfolios, foundation activities, and startup updates in real time. The walls held framed articles about my foundation's work, photos from conferences where I'd been keynote speaker, and awards from organizations recognizing my contributions to educational technology and women's entrepreneurship. I settled into my chair and opened my laptop, pulling up my contact lists. Time to plan a Thanksgiving that would redefine everything. I started with my college roommate Sarah, who now ran a successful marketing agency in Portland, Maine. We'd stayed close over the years, and she was one of the few people who knew about my financial success. Her text response came back within minutes. "Are you serious? Your Vermont mansion? I'll be there with bells on." Next was Janet Morrison, the venture capitalist who'd mentored me through my first major investments. Janet was in her 60s, brilliant, and had no patience for family drama, but she appreciated bold moves. "Darling, I wouldn't miss this for the world. I'm bringing my daughter and son-in-law. They need to meet you anyway." I texted my neighbor, 82-year-old Mr. Peterson, who lived alone in the farmhouse at the edge of my property. His children lived in California and rarely visited. He'd been feeding my horses and checking on the property whenever Thomas was away, refusing payment but accepting my dinner invitations with shy pleasure. Each yes response built my confidence and excitement. I wasn't just planning a dinner, I was creating something meaningful. I called Maria Santos, my housekeeper, who managed a team of local women providing cleaning and maintenance services for several high-end properties in the area. "Maria, I know this is short notice, but how would you feel about preparing for 50 guests this Thursday?" Maria's laugh was warm and knowing. "Miss Charla, you finally ready to show the world who you really are? We've been waiting for this day. Elena and I have been planning menus, just in case you ever decided to entertain properly." That comment stopped me short. "You've been planning menus? Honey, we've known from the beginning that someone with your resources and your heart wouldn't stay hidden forever. This house was meant for celebrations. We're ready." I hung up, feeling lighter than I had in years. My staff, my neighbors, my real friends, they all understood something my family had refused to see. I wasn't the struggling, delusional relative Madison had painted. I was someone who'd built something remarkable while staying humble enough to avoid the spotlight. But humility had its limits, and I'd reached mine. Time to step into the light and show everyone exactly who Charla had become. By Wednesday morning, my intimate Thanksgiving gathering had transformed into something I'd never anticipated. What started as a quiet rebellion against family rejection was becoming a major event that seemed to be organizing itself. The cascade began when Sarah posted on her Instagram story, Instead of just sharing our text conversation, she'd crafted something that caught fire across social media. Tomorrow, I'm having Thanksgiving at my friend's secret Vermont estate. The same friend who's been quietly changing the world through tech philanthropy while pretending to be just getting by. Some people are full of surprises. Sarah had tagged 3 other mutual friends from college, all successful in their own right. Emily, who'd become a documentary filmmaker, shared the story with commentary. Remember that classmate who was brilliant but never bragged? Turns out she's been busy buying estates and funding nonprofits. Can't wait to see what else she's been hiding. The shares multiplied from there, rippling through networks I'd forgotten were connected. My LinkedIn profile, which I'd kept deliberately understated, suddenly started receiving connection requests from people I hadn't heard from in years. But the real acceleration came from my angel investor network. Janet Morrison had mentioned the dinner to her investment group on Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, I was receiving texts from entrepreneurs and venture capitalists I'd worked with, but never socialized with outside of business contexts. Charla, is it true you're hosting Thanksgiving at your Vermont property? We'd love to attend if there's room. The message came from David Chen, CEO of a biotech startup I'd helped fund. His company was developing breakthrough treatments for childhood diabetes, and their recent clinical trials had been remarkably successful. Another text arrived from Patricia Williams, a Harvard Business School professor who studied women entrepreneurs. I'd guest lectured in her class twice, but we'd never moved beyond professional interactions. I hope this isn't presumptuous, but I'd be honored to join your Thanksgiving gathering if you're accepting additional guests. I'd love to bring my family. The most surprising message came from Robert Blackstone, a venture capital partner whose firm managed over $2 billion in assets. We'd been introduced at a conference 6 months earlier, and he'd invested alongside me in 2 startups. Charla, word is you're hosting something special tomorrow. Room for one more? I promise to bring excellent wine and interesting conversation. Each yes response changed the dynamic. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was becoming an unofficial summit of New England's entrepreneurial community. By noon, Wednesday, my guest list included 17 startup founders, 8 venture capitalists, 5 nonprofit directors, and 12 friends and colleagues from various industries. The average net worth of my attendees was climbing toward numbers that would have shocked my parents. Then the story reached Vermont's local media. The Rutland Herald called Wednesday afternoon. Miss Northwood, we understand you're the anonymous owner of the Woodstock estate who's been funding community center renovations and scholarships for local students. Would you be willing to confirm that you're hosting a large Thanksgiving gathering? I'd been careful about my philanthropy in Vermont, working through intermediaries to avoid attention, but apparently my work hadn't been as invisible as I'd thought. How did you find out about my community funding? I asked the reporter. Mrs. Henderson at the community center mentioned that their anonymous benefactor was hosting a large gathering at the estate. She was hoping to thank you in person for the $300,000 you've contributed over the past 2 years. Mrs. Henderson was the community center director, a 70-year-old dynamo who'd been trying to identify their mysterious donor since my first contribution. Apparently, she'd connected the dots when Thomas mentioned preparing for a large event. Would you be interested in covering the dinner? I heard myself asking. Not as an invasion of privacy, but as a story about community and gratitude. The reporter's excitement was audible. Absolutely. This is exactly the kind of positive story we love to feature, the mysterious philanthropist revealed. By Wednesday evening, the momentum was unstoppable. Chef Antoine Dubois, a James Beard Award winner who ran a restaurant in Montpelier, called personally. I heard about your gathering through the Vermont Restaurant Association. If you need additional catering support, I'd be honored to contribute. No charge. This is about community. I almost dropped the phone. You want to cook for my Thanksgiving dinner? For free? You've been supporting Vermont businesses and communities for 2 years without any recognition. Let us support you. Chef Isabella Rodriguez from Burlington called an hour later with the same offer. We heard what Antoine is doing. Count us in. Between the 3 kitchens, we can create something truly special. Maria had mentioned my event to local catering networks, not realizing it would create a chain reaction of professional chefs volunteering their services. But the most unexpected call came Wednesday night. "Is this Charla?" "This is Marcus Thompson." I recognized the voice immediately. Marcus was a Grammy-nominated musician who lived part-time in Vermont and part-time in Nashville. His folk rock style had earned critical acclaim and a devoted following. I'd attended one of his concerts at the Flynn Theater, but we'd never met personally. "I heard you're hosting something special tomorrow, and I wondered if you might like some live music. I'll be in Vermont anyway, and I'd love to contribute to what sounds like an amazing celebration." "Marcus Thompson wants to perform at my Thanksgiving dinner," I said out loud to my empty kitchen, just to hear how surreal it sounded. By Thursday morning, my guest list had reached 47 people, including business leaders, artists, community activists, and neighbors I'd only just met. The Vermont governor's office had called, asking if Governor Reynolds could stop by briefly to thank me for my community contributions. The documentary filmmaker Emily had convinced me to let her bring equipment. "This is a story worth telling, Charla. The successful woman who stayed humble. The community that rallied around generosity. The chosen family that created itself. This is what America looks like at its best." I stood in my kitchen Thursday morning, watching 4 professional chefs coordinate a feast that would rival anything served at the finest restaurants, and realized something profound had happened. I'd stopped hiding. For the first time in years, I was letting people see who I really was and what I'd accomplished. And instead of judgment or jealousy, I was receiving celebration, collaboration, and community. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "You realize this is going to be the most talked about Thanksgiving in Vermont history, right?" I looked around my mansion, filled with flowers and food and the energy of anticipated celebration, and smiled. Let it be talked about. Let the whole world see what Madison had convinced my family I was incapable of achieving. Tonight, the truth was going to shine brighter than anything my sister had ever imagined. Thursday morning dawned crystal clear. The kind of Vermont November day that makes tourists understand why people move here. Frost sparkled on my estate's rolling lawns, and the Green Mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it looked painted. I stood at my master bedroom window with my first cup of coffee, watching the catering trucks arrive at 7 in the morning. Chef Antoine and his team had driven up from Montpelier with a truck full of locally sourced ingredients. Chef Isabella's crew from Burlington followed 20 minutes later. Maria and her team had been working since 5 a.m., transforming my home into something that belonged on the cover of Architectural Digest. The main dining room, which could seat 24 at full capacity, had been expanded into the adjacent parlor and library. 3 elegant tables created an intimate yet grand setting for conversation and connection. Elena had arranged centerpieces using branches from my own maple trees, their autumn leaves creating warm splashes of gold and crimson against crisp white linens. My commercial-grade kitchen hummed with professional efficiency. Antoine was preparing heritage turkey with a bourbon glaze that filled the house with incredible aromas. Isabella focused on vegetarian options that were works of art. Butternut squash tart with caramelized onions, wild rice stuffing with Vermont cranberries, roasted root vegetables that looked like jewelry arranged on antique platters. Maria's team had prepared 12 guest bedrooms for attendees traveling from distant cities. Some guests had driven up Wednesday night and stayed over, turning the gathering into a true house party. I'd woken to the sound of laughter from the kitchen, where early risers were helping themselves to coffee and getting acquainted with other guests. At 9 a.m., I walked through my home with Emily, the documentary filmmaker, helping her understand the story she wanted to tell. "This isn't about wealth," Emily explained as her cameraman captured the morning preparations. "This is about authenticity and community." The woman who succeeded quietly and then chose to share that success generously. We filmed in my office, where the walls told the real story of my accomplishments. Awards from the Association of Small Business Investment Companies, a framed letter from the governor thanking my foundation for educational technology grants, photos from conferences where I'd spoken about women in entrepreneurship. "How long have you been hiding all this?" Emily asked, her camera capturing my genuine laugh. "I wasn't hiding," I said. "I was just living quietly, but maybe too quietly." By 10 a.m., guests began arriving in a steady stream that continued until mid-afternoon. Each arrival brought new energy and connection. Janet Morrison came first, her daughter and son-in-law in tow. Janet embraced me warmly and whispered, "Your parents have no idea who you've become, do they?" Her daughter, Lisa, a pediatric nurse, immediately connected with Mr. Peterson, comparing stories about caring for others. David Chen arrived with his wife and teenage twins, both kids, fascinated by the mansion's history and my horses. His son wanted to know about my technology investments. His daughter was more interested in my foundation's education programs. Patricia Williams brought her husband, a retired literature professor, who disappeared into my library within minutes of arrival and wasn't seen again until dinner was served. But the most meaningful arrival was Mrs. Henderson from the community center, accompanied by 3 families whose children had benefited from my scholarship programs. She'd driven up from town with tears in her eyes, carrying a handmade quilt created by the community center's seniors group. "We wanted to thank our mystery benefactor properly," she said, presenting the quilt. "Every square was made by someone whose life you've touched through your generosity." I held the quilt, examining the intricate patterns and knowing that hours of love had gone into every stitch, and felt emotions I hadn't expected. This was why wealth mattered, not for personal comfort, but for the ability to impact other people's lives in meaningful ways. The documentary crew captured these moments naturally, weaving together conversations and connections that illustrated something beautiful about chosen community and grateful celebration. Marcus Thompson arrived at noon with an acoustic guitar and a warmth that immediately drew people into conversation. He set up in the library's bay window, creating an intimate concert space that became the heart of the gathering. Guests drifted in and out of his impromptu performances, some sitting on the floor, others perched on antique chairs, all united by music that felt like the soundtrack to the most perfect day. Governor Reynolds arrived at 2 p.m. for what was supposed to be a brief visit, but stayed for an hour, genuinely interested in my foundation's work and the community connections being built through the gathering. He brought the state's tourism director, who was fascinated by my property's potential for hosting events that showcased Vermont's culture and values. "Have you considered opening the estate occasionally for nonprofit fundraisers?" the tourism director asked. "This kind of authentic Vermont elegance, combined with your commitment to community causes, could attract visitors who want to experience something meaningful, not just scenic." I hadn't considered it, but the idea intrigued me. My home could become more than a private retreat. It could be a catalyst for bringing people together around causes that mattered. The afternoon flowed seamlessly between indoor and outdoor activities. Thomas had set up a touch football game on the back lawn that attracted participants ranging from venture capitalists to local farmers. The sight of a billionaire tech investor catching passes from Mrs. Henderson's grandson created exactly the kind of authentic community connection that made the day special. Inside, conversations ranged across industries and interests with the kind of intellectual energy that comes when interesting people discover shared passions. I found myself moving between groups, facilitating introductions and watching new relationships form in real time. At 4 p.m., we gathered for dinner. Marcus provided acoustic background music, while Chef Antoine presented the meal with brief explanations of each dish's local sourcing and preparation. The food was extraordinary, but the conversations were what made the experience magical. Stories shared around the tables ranged from entrepreneurial challenges to community service projects, from family traditions to dreams for the future. Patricia Williams talked about her research on women's leadership styles. David Chen described his company's latest breakthroughs in diabetes treatment. Mrs. Henderson shared stories about the community center's programs and the families they served. But the moment that captured the day's spirit came during toasts. Janet Morrison stood first, raising her glass. To Charla, who proves that success is most beautiful when it's shared generously and celebrated openly. Then others began standing, each offering gratitude that went beyond politeness into genuine appreciation. Sarah thanked me for showing her what authentic friendship looked like. Marcus thanked me for creating space where music and community could intersect meaningfully. Mrs. Henderson thanked me for caring about people I'd never met. Emily captured these moments while remaining unobtrusive, creating a record of genuine connection and gratitude that felt more valuable than any professional video production. As dinner concluded and evening approached, I realized something remarkable had happened. What began as an act of defiance against family rejection had become a celebration of chosen community, shared values, and authentic success. I'd stepped fully into my identity as a successful entrepreneur and generous community member, surrounded by people who appreciated both my achievements and my character. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the day, but I'd ignored it completely, focusing entirely on my guests and the experience we were creating together. It wasn't until later that evening, as the last guests departed and Emily finished her final interviews, that I checked my messages and discovered my family's reaction to the day I'd chosen to live openly and authentically. The response was everything I'd expected and nothing I could have prepared for. I didn't check my phone until 10 p.m., after the last guest had departed and Emily had packed up her documentary equipment. The mansion felt wonderfully quiet, filled with the lingering warmth of celebration and the satisfaction that comes from a day lived fully and authentically. Maria and her team had efficiently cleaned the dining areas, leaving my home spotless but still fragrant with the sense of our feast. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that Robert Blackstone had brought, a vintage that probably cost more than Madison's monthly mortgage payment, and settled into my favorite chair in the library. My phone showed 37 missed calls and 82 text messages. The first message was from Madison, sent at 2 p.m. "What is this photo you posted? Whose house are you at?" I scrolled through my Instagram posts from the day. Emily had convinced me to share our celebration in real time, something I'd never done before. The photos told a story of luxury, community, and authentic joy that was impossible to misinterpret. The first image showed my dining room during setup, the elegant tables and professional flower arrangements clearly indicating serious wealth. The second captured Marcus performing in the library, with the room's custom bookcases and period furniture providing an unmistakably upscale backdrop. The third showed me chatting with Governor Reynolds on my terrace, the Vermont mountains stretching endlessly behind us. But the photo that seemed to have caught my family's attention was a group shot on my front steps, 47 guests arranged on the mansion's impressive entrance stairs, with the estate's grandeur providing an undeniable backdrop. I stood in the center, relaxed and radiant, surrounded by obviously successful and influential people who clearly viewed me as their host and peer. The messages from my family escalated throughout the afternoon, as more posts appeared on my social media and word spread through their own networks. Madison at 3 p.m. "Are you seriously claiming this is your house? This looks like a hotel or event space. Who are you trying to impress?" Mom at 3:30. "Honey, Madison showed me your photos. They're beautiful, but I'm confused about where you're celebrating. Can you call me?" Dad at 4 p.m. "Charla, your mother is worried. These photos look very expensive. Are you in some kind of trouble? Please call us right away." But the family messages were just the beginning. As the day progressed and Emily's documentary crew shared behind-the-scenes content, the story began reaching far beyond my personal social media. Vermont Business Magazine had picked up the story by evening, publishing an online article titled, "The Mystery Philanthropist Revealed. Tech Entrepreneurs' Thanksgiving Celebration Showcases Community Spirit." The article included quotes from Governor Reynolds, photos from the gathering, and details about my foundation's community contributions. Business Insider published a piece at 8 p.m., "From Stealth Mode to Center Stage. Vermont Tech Investor Hosts Star-Studded Thanksgiving." The article detailed my angel investing success, mentioned several of the high-profile attendees, and positioned me as an emerging power player in New England's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Forbes followed at 9 p.m. with a profile titled "The Quiet Millionaire: How One Woman Built an Empire While Flying Under the Radar." The piece traced my journey from graphic designer to tech entrepreneur to successful investor, including financial details that made my wealth impossible to dismiss or minimize. But it was the CNN segment that aired at 10 p.m. that really shattered my family's conception of reality. The network had picked up Emily's footage and run a feature story about authentic American success and community celebration. The segment showed clips from the dinner, interviews with guests discussing my community contributions, and enough shots of my estate to make its value unquestionable. The CNN piece included a brief interview with Marcus Thompson, who said, "Charla represents the best of American entrepreneurship, successful, generous, and focused on lifting up her community." Today's celebration was a master class in authentic leadership. By the time I finished reading all the coverage, my phone was ringing constantly. Dad called first, his voice tight with confusion and something that might have been panic. "Charla, what is all this? The news articles? The photos? People are calling us asking why we never mentioned our daughter was a millionaire philanthropist. What's going on?" "I'm having Thanksgiving, Dad. The same way Madison has Thanksgiving every year, with people who appreciate and understand me. But this house, this money, these important people. When did all this happen? How did this happen?" "It's been happening for years, Dad. I tried to tell you about my business success, my investments, my property purchases. You weren't interested in believing any of it." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Dad's voice came back, smaller and less certain than I'd ever heard it. "We thought. Madison said you were struggling, that the stories you told were what, Dad? Lies? Fantasies? Delusions? We were trying to be supportive without encouraging unrealistic thinking. Madison was worried about your mental health, and we thought." I hung up, not in anger, but because I couldn't handle the conversation while my emotions were still raw from the day's highs. Mom called immediately afterward, crying before she even spoke. "Charla, honey, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. The news articles, the photos, that beautiful house. Is that really your home?" "Yes, Mom, it's really my home. I bought it with money I made from selling my company. The same company I tried to tell you about, but you wouldn't listen," Madison said. She was concerned that you were living in a fantasy world, making up achievements to compete with her success. She said encouraging those stories would be harmful to your mental health, and you believed her instead of investigating for yourselves. Mom's crying intensified. "We thought we were protecting you. Madison is a doctor. She understands psychological issues, and she seemed so worried about you. Madison manipulated you, Mom. She convinced you I was delusional because my real success threatened the family dynamic where she was the golden child and I was the struggling failure." The hardest call came from Madison herself at 10:45. "How long have you been planning this?" she demanded without preamble. "This whole elaborate performance to embarrass our family?" "I wasn't planning anything, Madison. I was living my life quietly and successfully until you convinced Mom and Dad to exclude me from Thanksgiving entirely. Those photos are fake, aren't they? You rented that place for the day, hired actors to play successful friends, created some elaborate social media hoax to make yourself look important." Her desperate refusal to accept reality would have been funny if it weren't so revealing of her psychology. "Madison, Forbes published my net worth tonight. CNN interviewed my friends and business associates. The governor of Vermont was at my dinner. What part of that sounds like a hoax? I don't believe any of it. You're manipulating everyone somehow. You've always been good at creating stories and making people believe them." I hung up on her too, but the calls kept coming. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly reaching out, having seen the news coverage. Neighbors of my parents called, wanting to know why the family had never mentioned their daughter's achievements. Madison's friends were texting her with questions about her sister, the secret millionaire. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Madison had convinced our family that I was living in a fantasy world, inventing achievements to compete with her success. But tonight, the fantasy world was Madison's, where she could continue believing that she was the successful sister and I was the delusional failure. Reality had other plans. Tomorrow, the real confrontation would begin. I drove back to Boston Friday morning, needing the 2 hours of mountain highway to process everything that had changed in 24 hours. My phone had rung constantly since dawn, but I'd turned it to silent after the 15th call from reporters requesting interviews. The story had grown beyond local Vermont news and business publications. National media had picked up the narrative of the stealth millionaire's surprise Thanksgiving, and social media was amplifying the story with hashtags like Secret Success and Thanksgiving Revenge. But media attention wasn't my priority. I needed to address the family situation that had created this entire scenario. I'd texted Madison Thursday night. "We need to talk. Meet me at my apartment Friday at 2 p.m. Come alone." Her response had been immediate. "I'll be there. We're going to figure out what game you're playing." I arrived at my modest Boston apartment building around noon and found Madison's Mercedes parked illegally in front of the entrance. She'd been waiting for me for 2 hours, which meant she was either extremely eager for this confrontation or extremely anxious about what I might reveal. I parked in my assigned space in the underground garage and took the elevator to my floor, unsurprised to find Madison pacing the hallway outside my door. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her expensive clothing wrinkled as if she'd slept in it. Her eyes were red from crying or lack of sleep, possibly both. "Thank God you're finally here," she said, rushing toward me as I unlocked my door. "We need to talk about this insanity you've created. Do you have any idea what you've done to our family?" I gestured for her to follow me inside, noting how she immediately began examining my apartment with the intensity of a detective looking for evidence. My Boston home was deliberately modest. A comfortable one-bedroom with basic furnishings, neutral colors, and very few personal touches that might indicate wealth or success. I'd maintained it as my public face for exactly this reason, to avoid questions and attention from family members who weren't ready to see me as successful. Madison walked through the small space, clearly confused by the disconnect between what she'd seen in yesterday's photos and what she was seeing now. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, checking my kitchen cabinets as if looking for hidden cameras or props. "None of this makes sense. You live like someone struggling to pay rent. Where did that mansion come from? Who are those people claiming to be your friends?" I sat down on my couch and watched her investigation with something approaching pity. Madison was so committed to her version of reality that she couldn't process evidence that contradicted it. "Madison, sit down. We need to have a conversation that's been overdue for about 5 years." She perched on the edge of my chair, her body language defensive and tense. "Charla, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you rent that mansion for the day? Are you involved in some kind of elaborate fraud or con game? Because if you are, we can get you help before this goes too far." I pulled out my laptop and opened several browser windows. Let's start with some basic facts. Here's my LinkedIn profile, with my actual professional history. Here's the Forbes article from last night with verified financial information. Here's my foundation's website with audited records of our donations and programs. I turned the laptop toward her, watching her face as she scrolled through pages of documented evidence. "This is all fake," she said after several minutes, but her voice lacked conviction. "Anyone can create websites and fake articles." "Madison, CNN interviewed the governor of Vermont about my community contributions. Are you suggesting I somehow convinced CNN to broadcast fake news as part of an elaborate scheme to embarrass you?" She stared at the screen, her certainty beginning to crack. "I don't understand how any of this is possible. If you really have this much money, this much success, why have you been living like this?" She gestured around my modest apartment. "Because I wanted privacy. Because I knew that revealing my success would create exactly this kind of family drama. Because I've been protecting myself from people who weren't ready to see me as anything other than Madison's struggling younger sister." "That's not fair," Madison protested. "I've always supported you, always tried to help you succeed." This was the moment I'd been preparing for since Wednesday night. I picked up my phone and opened a folder labeled Family Documentation that I'd been building unconsciously for years. "Let me show you what your support actually looked like," I said, beginning to read from saved text messages and emails. "Here's your text from last Christmas. Charla seems lonely and bitter about being single. I worry she's making up business stories to feel better about herself. Here's an email to Mom from 6 months ago. I think we should stop asking about Charla's work projects. The stories are getting more elaborate, and I'm concerned about her grip on reality." I scrolled through more examples, watching Madison's face pale as she recognized her own words. "Here's your suggestion from Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Maybe we shouldn't encourage Charla's fantasies about property investments. It might be harmful to her mental health. And here's last month's family group chat where you wrote, I love Charla, but we need to be realistic about her limitations and stop feeding into delusions of grandeur. Madison sat in stunned silence as I continued reading her own words back to her. A systematic pattern of manipulation and undermining that was impossible to deny when collected in one place. You've been conducting a deliberate campaign to convince our parents that I was mentally unstable and living in a fantasy world, I said. Every time I tried to share genuine achievements, you reframed them as delusions. Every time I mentioned business success, you suggested it was compensation for personal failures. I was trying to protect you, Madison whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her. You were protecting yourself, I corrected. You were protecting the family dynamic where you were the successful one and I was the failure. My actual success threatened that balance, so you convinced everyone to ignore it. My phone rang, interrupting the confrontation. The caller ID showed Massachusetts General Hospital, Madison's workplace. Dr. Thompson? This is Patricia Morrison from Hospital Administration. We need to speak with you about some concerning materials that have been forwarded to our office. Madison's face went white as she realized I could hear both sides of the conversation. Materials? What kind of materials? Text messages and emails that suggest patterns of manipulative behavior toward family members. The hospital takes questions about physician character and professional judgment very seriously. We need you to come in Monday morning to discuss this matter. Madison hung up and stared at me in shock. You sent them our private family communications? I didn't send them anything, I said truthfully. But when your systematic manipulation of family relationships becomes public knowledge through news coverage and social media, professional colleagues start asking questions about your character. The irony was perfect. Madison had spent years trying to convince people I was unstable and delusional. Now her own behavior was under professional scrutiny because the truth about my success had revealed the extent of her manipulation. The medical board is opening an ethics investigation, Madison said, her voice barely audible. My department head is questioning my judgment. Bradley's law firm wants him to distance himself from any controversy. She looked around my modest apartment, then back at the laptop screen showing my actual achievements, finally beginning to grasp the full scope of what had happened. You've destroyed my life, she said. I've revealed your character, I corrected. The same way you tried to destroy my relationship with our family by revealing what you claimed was my character. The difference is that my achievements were real, and your accusations were lies. Madison broke down completely then, tears and apologies mixing with desperate attempts to justify years of manipulation. But I felt surprisingly little satisfaction in her distress. Mostly, I felt tired. What do you want from me? She asked finally. How do I fix this? I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd been so threatened by my potential success that she'd worked for years to prevent our family from recognizing it. Someone whose own achievements, impressive as they were, had never felt secure enough to coexist with mine. I want you to understand what you did, I said. I want you to take responsibility for the damage you caused, and I want you to decide whether you're capable of having a relationship with me that isn't based on your need to be the superior sister. Madison nodded through her tears, but I knew real change would take much longer than one afternoon conversation. The reckoning was just beginning, but for the first time in years, truth was finally on the table between us. 3 months later, Christmas Eve found me in my Vermont kitchen, preparing dinner for a very different kind of family gathering. Snow fell steadily outside my windows, covering the estate in pristine white that made the landscape look like a greeting card. The dynamics had shifted dramatically since Thanksgiving. My public emergence as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist had changed everything about how my family related to me, but the changes hadn't come easily or immediately. Mom and Dad had spent December in family therapy, working with a counselor who specialized in family communication and boundary setting. The sessions were painful but necessary, forcing them to confront how they'd enabled Madison's manipulation and failed to see my actual achievements for years. We were so focused on Madison's obvious success that we couldn't recognize yours was just quieter, Dad had admitted during our first family therapy session. We let her interpretation of your life become our interpretation, instead of asking better questions and looking more carefully. Mom had been even more direct. I failed you as a mother. I chose to believe Madison's version of who you were instead of building my own relationship with you. That was lazy and unfair, and I'm sorry. Madison's professional situation had stabilized after she completed an ethics review and anger management counseling required by the hospital. She'd lost her department head position but kept her job, forced to rebuild trust with colleagues and supervisors who now questioned her judgment and character. More importantly, she was slowly beginning to understand the psychological patterns that had driven her behavior. The therapy sessions revealed deep insecurity about her own achievements, fear that my success somehow diminished hers, and a need to control family narratives that stemmed from childhood competition she'd never outgrown. I couldn't stand the thought that you might be more successful than me, she'd admitted during our most recent therapy session. My identity was so wrapped up in being the successful daughter that your achievements felt like threats instead of celebrations. The work wasn't finished, but she was genuinely trying to change, which was more than I'd expected 6 months ago. Today's Christmas gathering was a test run for our new family dynamic, just the 5 of us: Mom, Dad, Madison, Bradley, and me. No extended family, no pressure to perform or impress, just an opportunity to practice relating to each other with honesty and respect. I'd prepared dinner in my Vermont kitchen, something I'd never done for my family before. Roasted prime rib with Yorkshire pudding, roasted vegetables from my greenhouse, and desserts that showcased local Vermont ingredients. Nothing too elaborate, but elegant enough to represent my actual lifestyle rather than the modest facade I'd maintained for years. Madison arrived first, driving up from Connecticut with Bradley and their children. She'd called ahead to ask what she could bring, something she'd never done in previous years when family gatherings revolved entirely around her preferences and schedule. "The house is incredible, Charla," Bradley said as I gave them a tour. "Madison showed me photos after Thanksgiving, but seeing it in person is something else entirely. You've created something really beautiful here." Madison stayed quiet during the tour, still adjusting to the reality of my success and lifestyle. But when we reached my office and she saw the awards and recognition covering my walls, she stopped in front of a photo from a conference where I'd been keynote speaker. "I've never seen this side of your life," she said softly. "I mean, I knew you were smart and talented, but I had no idea you'd built something this substantial. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took so long for me to see it." Mom and Dad arrived as the afternoon light was fading, bringing wine and genuine curiosity about my life that felt completely different from their previous polite disinterest. Dad spent 20 minutes in my library, asking thoughtful questions about my reading preferences and business philosophy. Mom wanted to understand my foundation's work, asking for details about programs and impact in ways that showed real engagement rather than polite tolerance. "I've been reading about angel investing," Dad said over dinner. "I had no idea how complex and strategic it is. Your track record is remarkable." "I've been volunteering with a literacy nonprofit in Hartford," Mom added. "When I told them about your foundation's work, they asked if there might be opportunities for collaboration. I said I'd ask." These were the kinds of conversations I'd wanted to have with my family for years. Substantive discussions about work that mattered to me, recognition of my expertise and achievements, interest in my perspectives and experiences. Madison contributed thoughtfully to these conversations, asking genuine questions about my investment strategies and foundation priorities without the subtle undermining that had characterized her previous comments about my work. The most significant moment came during dessert, when Dad raised his glass. "I want to propose a toast to new traditions," he said, "to family relationships based on who we actually are instead of who we assumed each other to be, to recognizing achievements even when they don't look like what we expected, and to Charla, for having the courage to show us who she really is." Madison raised her glass with tears in her eyes. "To my sister, who succeeded spectacularly while I was too insecure to notice. I'm sorry I wasted so many years being threatened by your success instead of celebrating it." As we cleaned up after dinner, Madison helped in the kitchen, something she'd never done at previous family gatherings. "I've been thinking about what you said in therapy," she said, loading dishes into my dishwasher, "about needing to decide whether I can have a relationship with you that isn't based on competition. I think I'm ready to try, if you're willing to be patient while I figure out how." I looked at my sister, seeing someone who was genuinely working to change patterns that had damaged our relationship for decades. The process would take time, and there would probably be setbacks, but her effort was authentic. "I'm willing to try," I said, "but with clear boundaries. No more subtle undermining. No more attempts to convince our parents I'm unstable or unsuccessful. If you have concerns about my choices or behavior, address them directly with me." "Agreed," Madison said immediately. "And I want you to call me out if I slip back into old patterns. I'm still learning to recognize when I'm being manipulative instead of supportive." As my family prepared to leave that evening, Mom hugged me longer than usual. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," she said. "Not just financially, but the way you've handled this whole situation. You had every right to cut us off completely after how we treated you. The fact that you're giving us a chance to do better says something beautiful about your character." Dad's goodbye was equally meaningful. "I want to understand your world better. Would you be interested in having lunch in Boston next month? Just the two of us, so I can ask questions and learn about your work without family dynamics getting in the way?" After everyone left, I stood in my kitchen cleaning the last of the dinner dishes and reflecting on how much had changed since that devastating text message in November. I discovered that hiding my success hadn't protected me from family judgment. It had enabled others to create false narratives about my life. I'd learned that authentic relationships required the courage to show people who I really was, even if they weren't ready to see it. Most importantly, I'd realized that family relationships, like any other relationships, had to be based on mutual respect and honest communication. I couldn't force my family to appreciate my achievements, but I could insist they treat me with basic respect and honesty. The past 3 months had been challenging, but they'd resulted in family relationships that felt real for the first time in years. Madison was learning to celebrate my success instead of undermining it. Mom and Dad were building genuine relationships with me based on who I actually was, rather than who they'd assumed I was. I wasn't naive enough to think all our problems were solved. Changing family dynamics that had been entrenched for decades would take continued work from everyone involved. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt seen and appreciated by my family for who I really was. As I turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs to my bedroom, I felt peaceful in ways that had nothing to do with financial success or professional achievement. I'd learned the most valuable lesson of all, that the most important gift you can give yourself is the courage to live authentically, even when the people you love aren't ready to see who you really are. Sometimes showing people what they're missing is the only way to help them understand what they have. What would you do if your family consistently underestimated your achievements and excluded you from important celebrations? Have you ever had to choose between hiding your success to keep peace or revealing your true self despite potential conflict? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like, subscribe for more stories about family dynamics and personal growth, and share it with anyone who might need to hear that their achievements matter, even if their family doesn't recognize them yet. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that your success is valid whether or not the people around you are ready to celebrate it. Here's to building the relationships we deserve and living authentically in all areas of our lives.